One of the most joyful things about Christmas, as we both know, Kamal, is spending time with the family, including, of course, our children. But many parents sadly won't be spending Christmas with their family because of something known as parental alienation.
It's described as a child's rejection of one parent because they have been manipulated by the other. We'll hear the stories of two mothers who say their relationships with their children have been sabotaged by the other parent.
We'll also be speaking to a family lawyer who explains how parental alienation claims can play out in the courts and why it's become such a contested concept.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed.
And me, Camilla Tominey. Many of you won't be familiar with this term parental alienation. I know I wasn't before we got into this subject, Kamal. It's sometimes also called alienating behaviours. So let's just start there. Currently no legal definition, but CAFCAS, the public body that promotes the welfare of children and families going through the family court, says alienating behaviours are, and I quote, where one parent expresses an ongoing pattern of negative attitudes and communication about the other parent that have the potential or intention to undermine or even destroy the child's relationship with the other parent.
So this idea of parental alienation is that one parent will tell lies, will twist the truth, will undermine the other. And then as a result of that, the child is then manipulated to believe they no longer want to see one of their parents. But as you say, Camilla, it is contested. It doesn't have a definition in law. It's not a specific crime. And as we'll hear later in the podcast, some parents who believe they have been alienated have tried and failed to take legal action and regain access to their children.
We also know that there are cases where an abusive ex-partner accuses the other parent of parental alienation to try and discredit the allegations of abuse, which complicates it. We haven't really spoken about this since Fathers for Justice did all of that campaigning, and that was about dads being alienated from their children, often in the middle of very, very messy divorces. But we also know that this can happen to mothers too. And very recently, the Family Justice Council, which is a public legal advisory body, it published new guidance for judges on the issue. And they say that the concept of parental alienation is being cited in the courts more and more often. They make the point about parental alienation's link to domestic abuse accusations, but they also said that there are genuine cases of alienating behaviours, but that they are relatively rare. Having said that, the effects on children, this report said, can be significant and enduring.
Clearly, it's a tremendously emotional subject. We've spoken to two alienated parents. They're both mothers who haven't had contact with their children for years. Now, for legal reasons, we've had to anonymise them both. But let's hear from a woman we are calling Rachel. She's a single mum who shared custody of her son with his dad from when he was 6 weeks old. She also has an adult daughter from a previous relationship. Rachel started by telling us how she became alienated from her son when he was just 11. Her words are voiced by an actor.
So there were no issues in the relationship with my son. You know, it was a standard mother-son relationship, you know, and it was 2019. And he'd spent the first 3 weeks of the 6 weeks on holiday with me, and the last 3 weeks were with his father, which is what we'd always done. And in fact, he'd had a bit of an argument with his dad, and he didn't want to go on holiday, and he wanted to stay with me the whole holidays. And of course I said, no, you know, you must go. You'll have a good time, you know. The argument will blow over, it's fine. And he went away on that holiday with his father. He had a lovely time. And I noticed that the contact sort of got less and less and less while he was away, which was unusual. And then I also noticed a slight change in the way he was speaking to me, slightly more abrupt. And again, very out of character for my son. So that sort of got me thinking, something's not right here. And then he returned from that holiday and he was due to start secondary school for the first time. I texted him and I said, I can't wait to see you on Wednesday, first day at school, I'll pick you up. And he said, I'm a bit tired after the holiday, so I think I'm going to stay with Daddy. So I was like, right, okay, yeah, okay, fine, okay. And then I wrote to my ex and I said, look, I know this weekend coming up is your weekend, strictly speaking, but, you know, you have had him for 3 weeks and I've missed him. So could I have him this weekend and we'll just go from there, alternate from there? And he said, no, you have to wait until next weekend. So it's going to be like another week now until I see him. So that's going to be 4 weeks. And then I was texting my son in that time and I was, you know, asking the usual questions. How did school go? Did you make any new friends or any of your old friends in your class? You know, standard stuff. And it was very sort of monosyllabic responses. Yeah, fine, no. I thought, this is really weird. I knew it was completely out of character. And on the approach to the following Wednesday, which was my date with him, I said, see you tomorrow. It's going to be great. Can't wait to hear all about it. What do you want for dinner? And again, I'm going to stay at my dad's. At this point, I reached out to my ex and he said, oh, just stop, you know, overreacting. It's, you know, he's preteen, you know, it's hormones. So I listened to all of this stupidly. And being a mother who's had this 11-year very close bond with my son, like, there's nothing I can tell you that, well, that was a bit strange or we had a difficult relationship. None of that. We were very, very close. Anyway, when this had gone on for, I think it was about 3 weeks, so now it's 6 weeks since I've seen my son, and I thought, you know what? I know where his train comes into after school, so I'm just going to turn up. And eventually, I saw my son and I called his name. And the look he gave me, I can't even describe it to you. That wasn't my son. He looked at me like he hated me. And I ran to him and I tried to, you know, hold his arm. Get off! Swearing at me. F off, I effing hate you. He said, I just don't want to see you. Why are you here? Why have you come? I said, because I haven't seen you for 6 weeks. Well, you know, you've got to come home. Come on. I don't want to. It was a barrage of, well, not abuse, but just hatred.
So there was nothing at all in the lead up to this post-holiday estrangement initially. It then turns into alienation. There was nothing at all to indicate that he would turn against you.
No. And he always had a relationship with his father. We managed it really, really well. There was never any issue of, well, no, you can't see him. We did it fairly.
And so after this sort of horrific 6 weeks of not seeing him and then total rejection, you're obviously trying to see him more. The ex then turns on you and reports you to the police, saying that you're harassing your own son. And then it becomes even more complicated.
Yeah, this is where it took a turn, really. I was at the train station. There was one specific day I went, and my ex bounded up to me, and he came up to me very angry. What are you doing here? You're just harassing him. I said, but I'm not harassing him. I'm trying to see my son because I don't know what's going on here. There's something very wrong. No, you're harassing him. He said, if you carry on like this, I'm going to call the police. And my son eventually came through the ticket barriers and he sort of said, right, come on, we're going. So I didn't even get a chance to say anything to my son. And then the next time, a couple of days later, when I went to the train station, my son said, well, you're just harassing me. It's harassment. And I thought, wow. This is another sign of parental alienation, when a child's parroting adult language. And I said, oh, where did you learn that from, Dad? I said, you know he's brainwashing you. No, he's not. No, he's not. I just don't want to see you. I hate you. You're a bitch. All that sort of language. And I said, right, I get that you feel all that, but why? I don't mind you saying all this. It is quite hurtful, I said, but tell me what I've done. Why are you saying this? And he's like, oh, just F off. And he'd walk off. I've never got to this day any answers. And I went back into town. I got a call. It was the police. They said, we've spoken to your son and he says that you're harassing him. So I told the police officer exactly what I'd been doing. I said, I'm just going to the train station because I haven't managed to see my son since he came back from holiday, and this is very unusual. And they said, we're not going to take any action this time. So then I became worried and I thought, oh, well, I don't want to get arrested or whatever. So I still used to go, but just less and less and less.
And then did you have to get the courts involved?
Well, I didn't know what parental alienation was. I was like a rabbit in the headlights. I was bewildered. And it was upsetting. I just missed my son so much. And I did what most good people do, and I turned to the internet. And I just started doing research, and I started typing in words, and I got to a thread, and I saw those words, parental alienation. I replied to a guy who was an ex-police officer, actually, who'd been alienated from his daughter. And he sent me a direct message, and he said, you're being alienated from your child, and if you don't do something about it, you might never see him again. He told me his story and how he'd not seen his daughter for many, many years. He said, your son's not going to suddenly come back by himself. Your ex isn't going to advocate for you. He's already not doing that. He said, you need to make an application to the court. You need to get in front of a judge and tell them what's going on. So I did that, and I had an initial hearing, just myself and the judge, no one else. She said, why are we here today? And I told her, and she said, right, okay, I'll get this listed for another hearing. And this is one of the big problems with the family court system. You're then waiting months. So that's another 2 months on top of the time already I hadn't seen my son, and it wasn't getting any better. He then blocked me. I still got messages from him. He said he was 11 and saying things like, well, you're being unreasonable. That's adult language. No 11-year-old uses the word unreasonable. I thought, God, I'm banging my head against a brick wall here. And, I mean, after a 2-year battle, there is a court order.
Saying what?
Saying that I have equal parental responsibility for my son with my ex. That and a whole list of things that my ex has to do. He has to send me photos of my son every few weeks, has to keep me updated about his life, let me know about any medical issues. He hasn't. He hasn't done anything that he's supposed to do that's listed in that court order for over 2 years now. And my only options are I can go back to court and I can try and enforce the order, but they're not going to do anything. They're just going to tell him off and that'll be it. So court orders are not worth the paper they're written on. They're not enforceable. And my son is now 16.
So you've seen him once since 2019, and that was around Christmas 2023.
Yeah.
That was after you managed to contact him on Snapchat. Tell us about that Christmas 2023 meeting.
It only happened because, as I say, I'm blocked everywhere, and I'd been bugging the hell out of my daughter, bless her, because she's been stuck in the middle of this, really. And I said, God, what does he want for Christmas? I want to get him something. She's like, OK, I'll Snapchat him. And I had a bit of a light bulb moment and I thought, ooh, Snapchat. I haven't tried that. So I created this Snapchat, fake Snapchat account, and I messaged my son and I said, sorry, son, I know this is a bit awkward. I didn't know how else to contact you. So I wondered how your leg was because he'd had time off school because he'd pulled his hamstring playing football. And I got a response. He said, yeah, it's okay, thanks. Just that, just those words. I was like, because this is the most contact I've had from him at that point for 4.5 years. So I was so happy about this. But then, as an alienated parent, when you first get that response, you can't sort of launch into, oh my God, I'm so happy. You've almost got to act like nothing's happened. Like the last 4.5 years have never happened and your heart hasn't been broken. So I was like, oh, that's good. You know, and I'm just doing this random small talk with my son. And I just said, what would you like for Christmas? And then I said, well, I'd really like to give it to you in person. Would that be okay? I mean, because he always goes to his sister's over Christmas for a couple of days. And he said, yeah, that'd be okay. So we drove there. Of course, what I wanted to do was just burst into tears and to run to him, but you can't do that. I said, hi, son. He's like, hi. And I walked over to him. I said, can I give you a hug? And he stood up. My son was probably up to my breastbone when I last saw him. Now he's over 6 feet tall. So when he stood up, I said, oh, gosh, you're so tall now. And my eyes were already filling with tears at this point. And he hugged me and I said, I love you. He said, I love you too. I will hold on to that, I love you too, for the rest of my life, even if I never see him again. And I haven't seen him since that day. We ate dinner together as a family, all of us. We played board games. And I noticed he kept looking at his phone and he looked kind of a bit sad. And I said, everything all right? Yeah, my dad's here. He's outside. He actually looked sad that he had to go. I mean, I might have got that wrong, but he looked disappointed. I hugged him again. I said, I love you. I love you so much. I've really missed you. And I kissed him on the side of his face. He said, I love you too, again. And then he left. And then we carried on sort of Snapchatting every now and again. Because again, you don't want to bombard them. You don't want to scare them away. You're walking on eggshells. And I think the reason why he blocked me on Snapchat, well, I think my fault. I think I've just pushed things because I love him so much. I've missed him. I pushed things too much too soon. I messaged him on Snapchat and we were going backwards and forth. And then I said something like, my biggest regret was letting you go on that holiday. And he said, what do you mean? I said, you didn't want to go on that holiday. You'd had a row with your dad. And he said, no, you're lying. And my son didn't like hearing that. Maybe because he remembers that happening. He said, well, if you don't stop, I'm going to block you. And I said, well, I've been blocked for 4.5 years, so status quo, isn't it? And then he blocked me on Snapchat. And I've not heard from him since.
But your son is now 16. I mean, one hope must be for you that as he comes into adulthood, you may be able to rediscover a relationship as he becomes more autonomous. And my assumption is that this seems to have come from your ex-partner, is your belief, is it?
Yeah.
But as your son grows up, will that give you another opportunity to engage? I wonder what advice you've been given about the next few years.
It can happen, and there are stories of hope, but you're never guaranteed that. You never give up hope. Yes, that tends to happen when the child is away from the controlling parent. The reality, my reality, is that I may never see my son again. But I can't linger on that too long, otherwise I just wouldn't get on with my life. And there was a time in my life when I didn't want to be alive anymore. And that, again, is the reality of so many alienated parents. And many alienated parents follow through on that. I've got stories, I can tell you, of adults who've taken their own lives because the family court says, but your child doesn't want to see you. There's nothing we can do. And that's my question to the family minister or the justice minister. Why can't you do anything? The judge should have banged her gavel right at the start of this process and said, I'm sorry, your son needs to go home to his mother. But they don't do that.
Have all your friends been supportive? I'm imagining that some people listening to this would say, there must be something. There must be something that has gone wrong here, that you have done wrong. It must be blame on both sides, or something's happened here that we don't know about. Now, I just wondered if you've had to navigate that with your friends or people just not believing you.
Yes, and actually, the worst culprits were the mum friends. And these are mothers who have known or knew me since my son was 5. Their kids have had play dates at mine. I've fed their kids. They've had sleepovers. My son's been to there. They know me as a mother and how devoted I still am, was when my son was little. People I thought were friends, and none of them supported me when this happened. They all turned their backs. They didn't want to know. And I'm sure maybe they've heard another version from my ex, perhaps. I dread to think what he's told people. I dread to think what he's told my son. I really do. As I always say, look, all parents, mothers and fathers, now and again, we have to discipline our kids. We have to say no. That's normal parent-child relationship. But you also show your child love and affection and admit when you're wrong. And it's hard. Being a mum's hard. When you're a single mum, it's really hard. And also, having a co-parent who is never backing you up, that's another sign as well for any parents listening. The undermining of a parent, especially in front of the child. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But looking back now, I realise that this drip, drip, drip feeding of negativity about me and manipulation no doubt started when my son was old enough to speak and understand. And that's the other thing with parental alienation. It doesn't just happen overnight. Because people say, what, so he went on holiday and he just came back and his dad made him hate you? I say, no, it's insidious. This happens over many, many, many years.
What next for you in terms of your family relationships and particularly your relationship with your son?
Well, I just continue to live in hope that one day my son will reach out through his sister, my daughter, maybe, and I hope that people in my son's life might advocate for me a bit, but until then, I've just sort of got to carry on with my life. I've got all this maternal love and I've got nowhere to put it. That's the hardest thing. But, you just do what all of us alienated parents do, which is to hope and just carry on with your life and be the best version of you so that if and when your child does return, you want to be someone that your child wants to return to.
The thing about listening to that, Kamal, is you can hear in Rachel's voice there, there's a degree of complete desperation, and also there's so much unknown and unsaid. She can't really pin down why this has happened, how it has happened, how it continues to happen. And all you can feel for her is just, she is basically grieving. She is in a period of grief now for the son that she loved and now feels she's lost.
Yes, and that issue of grief is something that the next mother we speak to gets into, and it's fascinating to hear what she says about that issue. This is a woman in her 60s, we're calling Jeanette, who, when she asked for a divorce from her alcoholic husband, found herself becoming alienated from her teenage daughter. That was back in 2005, meaning Jeanette has now endured nearly 2 decades of alienation.
Asking for a divorce, I thought, was going to be an easy process, as in we were going to be grown-ups and we were going to be respectful of each other, and that was the way I went into it. But it's not what happened. And within 24 hours, I suddenly found I wasn't able to spend time on my own with my daughter anymore, which I'd done quite safely and happily for the first 14 years of her life. And I really didn't know what was happening. I just couldn't put my finger on any of it. It felt so strange. I used to take her to school, or she used to go and catch the bus to go to school. And all of a sudden I found she wasn't even at home to go to school. She'd already gone. I went to school to fetch her and she wasn't there. And she never came home. And that first week was just a whirlwind of, what on earth's going on? Where is she? And she'd come home late. And by the end of the first week, she'd gone from a very loving child to somebody who wouldn't speak to me. And by the end of 5 weeks, she was somebody I didn't recognise at all, because she wasn't a child that had tantrums or anger or any of those things. But all of a sudden she was. And by the end of the 5 weeks, I realised she was being taken to various people's homes straight from school so that I wasn't able to spend time with her. And it was just the most weird place to find myself, suddenly just abandoned and not able to get any answers.
And do you put that all down to your former husband?
Oh, absolutely. It was made very clear that I wasn't allowed to spend time on my own with her again. I have to say the fear inside was huge. The internal fear, I didn't know how to control it. I was very, very distressed. And trying to make sense of it was nonsensical. I had no one to turn to, whereas in the past I had asked for help within the family because of what was happening with him, and literally, they'd turned their backs to me. And then all of a sudden I find that they're all in collusion, and it's like they've put a brick wall between us. And I couldn't get over the brick wall, and I just didn't know how to. And it was a very emotional time, very emotional time. I didn't know which way to turn. She wouldn't speak to my family, none of my brothers that she was very close to. My mother tried to speak to her, but she just literally blanked everybody. And by the end of that first week, I'd been told that I had to give up all my friendships with her friends' mothers, because if I didn't, she would ditch all her friends. I found myself very isolated, but I refused to give up the friendships.
What was your relationship previously like with your daughter?
I'd always thought it was very healthy. We had a great relationship. It wasn't that very common thing of she's my friend, because I didn't believe that was a healthy relationship. I was mum, so I was that place of safety for her to turn to when she needed to. And we always talked quite frankly and openly, I assumed, I felt at the time, about everything, to the point that she'd actually come between the ex and I once or twice because of his drinking problem, and defended me against him. So for all this to happen so rapidly was quite a shock, to say the least.
When was the last cordial conversation you had with your daughter?
I can remember it. I can remember it so exquisitely. So the journey from then to 2015 was very haphazard, an awful lot of eggshells. 2015, she just had her first child, and it was the very last time I saw her. She came to meet my partner and myself, my godson and his partner, and we had a beautiful, happy dinner together, and everything was lovely. And that was the very last time I saw her.
You're not only an estranged mother, but as you just said, you're also an estranged grandmother. What contact, if any, have you had with your grandchildren, I think it is now?
I've only ever seen my eldest granddaughter 5 times. I've never met the second grandchild. I have no idea if there are any others.
And how does that add to how you feel about what you've been through over the past years?
You know, we're brought up to be societal animals. We're brought up to be mum, grandma, aunt, all of these different titles that we have within our communities. And all of mine have been stripped away. It leaves you standing on the edge, looking in, and you can't have a voice. You can't send gifts. You can't write cards. All the normal things that we do, all the normal things that we have an expectation of. I haven't been able to do any of those things.
And how do you kind of keep abreast of what's going on? I mean, have you made it your sort of mission to make sure you try and follow what your daughter and your grandchildren are doing on social media? Or
Oh, no, absolutely not. I was completely blocked from everything. I can't see them.
and no word of mouth sort of updates or anecdotes?
Nothing. Nobody tells me anything. It's a form of ambiguous grief. It's a disconnection where you know that person is there, but you have no normal avenue of contact. In much the same vein as somebody who has Alzheimer's, where you see them disappearing in front of you and they don't know who you are and they can't communicate with you in the same way as they would have done before the dementia took hold. So it's ambiguous grief is actually quite destructive, because for those that can't lift themselves up out of it, they stay stuck in that well of emotion, that anxiety and depressive behaviors and thoughts, feelings, and emotions that just keep them trapped in a place of misery.
Were you able to use the law at all, or did you explore that? Because often in these situations, you end up in court.
Yeah. I was talking to the solicitor through the divorce, but she blankly told me, you have a 14-year-old daughter who's got a voice of her own, and they won't entertain it in court. So I never even got the opportunity. That was denied to me.
Have you managed to go on a journey that's lifted you out of it a little, or does it feel just as traumatic now as when it started?
It has its moments of being very traumatic. So even after 20 years, I can still suddenly find myself thinking, oh, help. And all that emotion comes. But it's not the same emotion as the other levels of stuff I've dealt with. It's a whole new level that hasn't yet been dealt with. There are still those moments where it catches me. It's like you can't escape.
Certainly two mothers who have devastating stories. But as you mentioned at the start, it's quite poorly understood, this whole area, this whole concept, and it's actually become pretty controversial. Many alienated parents believe it is a form of child abuse, coercive control of a child by one parent and against the other. But women's rights campaigners have raised concerns that the concept is being used as a way of silencing abuse victims, particularly women.
So this is one of the key themes in that new guidance we mentioned by the Family Justice Council. So these are these guidelines for judges when they come across allegations of so-called alienating behaviours. The guidelines say that the accusations of parental alienation, quotes, are often raised in response to allegations of domestic abuse, and that the two cannot be equated. So domestic abuse being a crime and then parental alienation. The guidelines, though, have upset some alienated parents because they're saying that there isn't a diagnosable syndrome of parental alienation. The report says that's a myth. Now, some alienated parents have taken that to read, you don't believe us. You are saying that our children haven't been manipulated against us. It's not quite saying that. What it's saying is that this idea that it is a scientific syndrome that can be sort of diagnosed and then dealt with and even medicalised by so-called experts isn't quite right. So I think what the report is actually trying to do is protect the genuine victims of parental alienation against a new industry that appears to have sprung up trying to cash in on their misery. And of course, what it's also trying to do is distinguish between genuine victims of parental alienation and malicious claims that somebody is separating them from their parent in a bid to win a divorce battle.
That seems exactly right. Someone who worked on the guidance is Jenny Beck Casey. She's a family lawyer who sits on the Family Justice Council, and she joins us on the Daily Tea now.
Jenny, how often do you see allegations of parental alienation, and is it on the rise?
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you both. Well, I think it's important to draw a distinction between allegations of alienation and cases where alienation has occurred. Obviously, where alienation has occurred, that's absolutely devastating and its impact can be very enduring. But research evidence does show that those actual cases are relatively rare. What's definitely on the rise are allegations of alienating behaviour. And that might be in a case where a child's reluctant to see a parent, but that child may not have been manipulated. The allegations are there, but until there are findings that the child has been manipulated, they remain allegations.
So when we've spoken to people who have not seen their children in some years and they are blaming often the ex-partner for coercively controlling the child against them, surely that is a thing. I mean, some of these cases don't end up going to court, but the alienated parent absolutely insists that this is the case.
No, I completely understand. And that's a really devastating situation to find yourself in, where your child is withdrawn from you for reasons which aren't immediately apparent. But there are a whole range of reasons why a child might be reluctant to see a parent, and they need sensitively unpicking. Just because there isn't an obvious reason for that withdrawal doesn't mean to say you should jump straight to the idea that that child has been deliberately manipulated or has been purposefully alienated. There could be a number of different reasons why that child might have withdrawn, and it's very important to make sure that there's a proper factual basis for any allegations that are made.
But just to hammer home on that point, Jenny, in the guidelines, there's the suggestion that the idea that there's a sort of diagnosable syndrome of parental alienation in children is a myth. And I think if you're affected directly by this as a mum or a dad or indeed a grandparent, you might find that quite offensive, because in the case of children who have been manipulated away from one parent or another for no good reason, the sort of victims in that are liable to want this to be something that can be given a recognised name.
But it isn't a recognised syndrome. It's not a psychological syndrome. That isn't to say that children aren't manipulated by parents. And where that does happen, it's absolutely awful and it's enduring and frightening and wrong. But it isn't a syndrome. It's not a diagnosable syndrome that's recognised. And that's where we've got a problem, because an industry has been created out of a fiction that there is some sort of scientific basis for this parental alienation syndrome. There is no basis, and it is a pseudoscience, and it's a dangerous pseudoscience because it's had this industry created around it where people have set themselves up as experts diagnosing something which can't be diagnosed.
Jenny, we've featured 2 stories of mothers who have been alienated, but in your experience, is this something that is normally claimed more by men?
I don't have the data to help identify whether there are more men alleging alienation than women. However, I am fairly sure that there has been an increase in allegations, and there is a strong link between allegations of alienation and in response to allegations of domestic abuse, which is, of course, a gendered crime and massively impacts women more than men. In my experience, more men allege parental alienation than women.
Jenny, obviously, this is where emotions and the law can sometimes lock horns. How do you unpick, in a legal sense, when you've been presented with a case where maybe one parent believes that it is alienation, it is manipulation of a child, and there are no other reasons? How do you work through that as a lawyer?
Well, thankfully, the guidance is actually quite helpful on that. In fact, it's one of its purposes to try to help weave a way through that particular minefield. And what the guidance tells us is that we really need to make sure that there are 3 essential elements to establish that a child has been manipulated or alienated. And firstly, obviously, there has to be reluctance, resistance, or refusal on the part of the child to see a parent. Then there has to be the absence of a justified reason for that. And a justified reason might, for example, include if that child has witnessed domestic abuse or has been treated cruelly, or there is another reason that justifies that child's rejection. If there's no justified reason for that child's rejection and the child is rejecting the other parent, it still needs to be shown that the parent who's accused of alienation has actually engaged in an act or acts which have manipulated the child so as to not wish to see the other parent.
How would you ever prove that, though? I mean, if there aren't actually sort of text messages or dialogues that have been recorded in some way, how on earth do you prove that what the other parent might have been saying about you behind your back?
That's the job of the courts. Finding that factual matrix and working out the facts is the remit of the courts. And I think there's been a dangerous trend towards using experts to effectively diagnose whether alienation has happened or not. There is a proper process to be followed for the court to establish whether, on the balance of probabilities, an allegation is proven or not. And exactly the same process is followed for allegations of domestic abuse.
But even where the courts try and enforce shared custody, we know of many cases, and it's not just in parental alienation, just in very, very messy divorces. We do hear stories at the Telegraph of parents still not being able to see their children. I mean, how is it ever enforced? The police don't come round and check, do they, if a court order for shared custody is being abided by?
Absolutely not, no. No, absolutely. It's the reason why we try to avoid the courts in private disputes over arrangements concerning children, because it's really difficult to enforce an order, particularly on a child who doesn't want to go once they reach a certain age. It's far better if parents can learn to work cooperatively together, even if that's difficult, to try and find a solution which centralises the child's best interests and allows them to co-parent without the involvement of the court.
Jenny, are the family courts fit to do the work that you say they should be allowed to do? And if they're not, who then supports the parents on this journey?
It really depends what's happened in the family dynamic. Where there's been domestic abuse, for example, which could provide the justified reason for a child's rejection of a parent. Now, that domestic abuse might be something which one parent doesn't believe has affected the child, and they may therefore wonder why this child doesn't want to see them. But the child might have perceived their own interpretation of what's happening in the family dynamic, and they might reject a parent and form an alliance with the other parent, which might not seem justifiable to the parent who's missing out on time with them. But nevertheless, the child's made a decision on the basis of its own perception, and children's voices should be heard. Many cases of alleged alienation do also involve domestic abuse. There's quite a link between the two. So there's obviously, in circumstances where there's a potential risk to either of the parties or the child, there's a great need for the court to be involved in a protective capacity. However, there are also many cases where it's far better if the parents can form an agreement between the two of them safely without the courts being involved at all.
Give us some hope here, Jenny. How many times have you been involved in a case where one parent truly believes, honestly, that the other parent has manipulated the child away from them, but actually with work, they've actually come to a mediated settlement? Have you seen evidence of that, and what lessons are there from any of those cases?
I obviously deal with quite a lot of very serious cases, and the problem with parental alienation and the industry that's grown up around it is that it really, really polarizes parents. So by the time lots of cases get to me, the parents are so significantly polarized that they just can't see there could be any other reason for this child's rejection than the other person's behavior. But if people can stop and not go down this particular path too early, and can perhaps think about what other reasons a child might have, and they may not even be able to understand those reasons, but properly thinking with the child's best interests at heart as to how you could stand back, listen to the child, hear their concerns, perhaps react in a different way so as to try to build that relationship with the child and encourage the child to want to spend time with you. That's a far better way forward. And then that can be achieved by discussion, via mediation, or some other collaborative form of parenting. The difficulty is that the subject matter itself is so polarizing, people can become very entrenched.
And Jenny, have you seen examples of that? Have you been in cases where actually you've managed to at least set them on a path which didn't end up in the two of them still as split as when they first met you?
Absolutely. I absolutely have. And that can happen with good early legal advice by well-qualified lawyers who understand the trajectory that these cases might go on if they were to come to court, and how polarizing that can be. So good early legal advice can allow people to understand what might happen if they carry on down a litigious path, and also with the guidance which now tells us about these three critical elements, a solicitor can work through with their client whether there might be another explanation, and then hopefully work together with the other parent to encourage the child to want to see both parents where of course it's safe to do so.
Jenny Beck Casey, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Daily Tea. I can understand exactly what Jenny is saying there about an industry having been built up around this. And actually, if there are pseudo-scientific experts trying to make money from people's misery, then that's really bad. But I do think there is a case for parents whose children have literally disappeared from their life with no good reason, having nowhere really to turn. Because even Jenny had to admit that even if the court decides something, it doesn't mean that it can be enforced or enacted upon. If the child continues to not want to see one parent, there's not much you can do about it.
I felt there was a little bit of optimism in what Jenny said about cases that she had become involved in when there had been polarisation and they had managed to work together, maybe not only with Jenny, but with mediation, where it got the parents to not just see maybe slightly more each other's point of view, but also the child's voice, and the point that the child may say something that you simply don't believe has happened or even hasn't happened. These are young children or young people, and they will often believe something. But that's not, Camilla, from what you're saying, that's not for a second to say that there aren't genuine cases where one parent has manipulated a situation to mean that the other parent is excluded. And that must be so difficult and frustrating, because this is private space, isn't it? As you say, there's not going to be a whole screed of texts on something.
No.
It may just be a conversation and an argument, and to resolve that through any kind of mediation or legal system is going to be very difficult, because who outside the two people who are involved in this relationship knows the truth?
And also, you cannot possibly listen to the incredibly emotional experiences of Rachel and Jeanette and not feel intense sorrow for them, but also not viscerally sense their feeling of absolute powerlessness. There is this sense that not that many people are helping these alienated parents, and the idea of being separated from your children when it's the last thing you want must be incredibly difficult.
Certainly remarkable testimony, great honesty, and an incredibly difficult subject. The Daily Tea will be back Monday, 5 p.m.